Good morning and welcome to the first edition of Mrs. Mack Knows a Lot About That. Today we're discussing Chapter 4, Section 1, the organization of life, and we're going to start by talking about ecosystems. An ecosystem is defined as a communities of organisms and their abiotic environment. So, for example, you might have a coral reef, that would be an ecosystem, or a forest, or a pond. Okay, those are all ecosystems. Ecosystems do not have clear boundaries, and things can go from one ecosystem to another at any time. For example, pollen can blow from a forest into a field, or soil can wash from a mountain into a lake. Birds migrate from state to state. We see birds migrating now south for the winter. Okay, so ecosystems are not boundaries where these living things have to stay. They are fluid, so living things can come and go through the ecosystems as they please. There are different levels of ecological organization. We start with an organism, which is the individual. Then you have a population, which is a group of those same species of animals. Then you have a community, and that's a lot of the living things that are in that area. And then you have the ecosystem, which is the living things as well as the non-living things. And then you have the biosphere, which is life on Earth. So if we look at the components of an ecosystem has to have 5 things in order to survive. They have to have energy, they have to have minerals or nutrients, water, oxygen, and living organisms. Now, there are parts of the ecosystem that are non-living that contribute to the running of the ecosystem, but these are the 5 requirements that they have to have for an ecosystem to survive. If a part of the ecosystem is destroyed, that will change the entire ecosystem. So for example, if we eliminate a species of animal, that affects the entire ecosystem. Now, when we talk about biotic and abiotic factors, bio means living. So those are anything that is living, including dead things, okay, or waste products from those organisms. The abiotic, A means non and bio means living. So these are non-living factors of the environment. They're not things that are living. And this includes things like air and the soil and the temperature. They affect the ecosystem, but they're not living. And so scientists organize these living and non-living things into different levels. We'll watch that video later. Organisms are living things that can carry out life processes independently. You're an organism, ants are an organism, bacteria living in your gut are organisms, okay? Every organism is a member of a species. Species are groups of organisms that are closely related. Species can mate to produce fertile offspring. Now you might be thinking, but there are examples of things that can mate that are not the same species. For example, like a liger, a lion and a tiger. Sometimes that does happen, but when that happens, that animal that is produced, that offspring, they would not be able to have offspring of their own. Another example would be a mule, which is a cross between a horse and a donkey. So those are examples of things that can mate, but then mules would not be able to have other mules. The only way to make a mule is to breed a horse and a donkey. Then we have something called a population. Populations are members of a species that may not live in all the same place, so they can live wherever. For example, a field mice in Maine is not going to interact with a field mice in Texas, but they are each part of a population. Populations are groups of organisms of the same species that live in a specific geographical area and interbreed. The field mice in Maine are part of a population of field mice in Maine. The field mice in Texas are part of a population of field mice in Texas. They are each part of their own population. Even though they're the same species, they could breed if they were in the same area, but since they're not really considered part of the same population because populations involve that geographical area, and they're going to be able to have that ability to breed because they're in the same area. An important characteristic of a population is that the members of that population typically only breed with one another rather than the members of other populations. So if the animals in one population together, they're going to breed, but they're not necessarily going to breed with another population of the same species. So a bison will mate with another member of the same herd, but they're not necessarily going to go out and find a new herd to mate with. Flowers in the same field pollinate because they're in close proximity. They're not necessarily going to go and pollinate with flowers that are 100 miles away. Then you have what's called a community. Now, this is various groups of species that live in the same habitat. So they're different species, they live in the same habitat, they interact with each other. Every population is part of a community, okay? But the difference between a population and a community is now you have different species in that community. Land communities often have some species of plants, and then those plants determine what animals live in that area, because animals aren't going to live in an area if they're not going to be able to get food in that area. Your habitat is the place where the organism lives. Every habitat is unique to that organism that lives there, and it has specific things that those organisms need to survive. If those factors of that environment change, the habitat changes. And if the animals aren't suited to live in that environment anymore, they would have to leave and find a new place to live, or they will die. So animals and plants usually cannot survive for long periods away from their natural habitat. Now, we do take animals from their natural habitat and we put them in zoos. Those zoos have to do the best thing that they possibly can to make sure that that habitat they're living in is similar to the habitat they came from, or else those animals are not going to survive. There's another video we'll watch later. And then here are your questions that you will be answering as a review or summary of what we just covered. If you have any questions at any time, please let me know, and I will see you for the next edition of Mrs. Mack Knows a Lot About That.